Christmas is supposed to be about lights and family, but sometimes the holidays just open a door that should have stayed shut. These 3 disturbing Christmas horror stories are inspired by real events. We're talking about regular people, a curious kid on a family trip, a teacher in a historic home, and a mechanic just trying to get back to his kids. First, a 7-year-old boy at a remote mountain hotel notices the massive Christmas tree is moving on its own, and the only person willing to help him investigate is a doorman who seems to know too much about the hotel's dark past. Next, a family in Charleston is tormented by distorted holiday music coming from inside their walls, until the mother makes the mistake of knocking on the plaster to see if anyone is listening. And finally, a mechanic driving home on Christmas Eve hits a patch of heavy mist and realizes too late that he has driven his car into a violent memory from 300 years ago. If you are looking for true scary stories, paranormal encounters, and unexplained mysteries that will ruin your silent night, you are in the right place. But don't get too comfortable, because the scariest thing about the holidays isn't the dark outside. It's the realization that you invited something inside, and now it refuses to leave. So make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you know exactly what's coming for you next. Driving through those mountain passes back in December of 1984, you'd think the world ended just past your own headlights. Snow fell in heavy, wet sheets that swallowed the sound of the station wagon's engine, burying the road under a thick white blanket that seemed to move in the wind. David was only 7 years old then, a skinny kid with his face pressed against the glass, watching the dark pines whip past like ragged ghosts. They were headed for the Grand Stone Hotel, a massive pile of granite and timber tucked so deep into the peaks you'd think the mountain itself had spit it out. It was a high-end place, the kind where the lobby smelled like expensive tobacco and aged brandy. In the dead center of the ballroom stood a Nordmann fir that reached 20 feet toward the rafters. It wasn't just standing there, it was anchored. Heavy iron hardware, the kind used to hitch trailers to trucks, was bolted right through the base of the trunk and deep into the thick oak floorboards. Most folks saw a centerpiece of holiday cheer, but David looked at those bolts and saw a permanent anchor for a memory that would eventually pull him into a very dark place. Old Man Johnson was the first person David saw when the car finally lurched to a halt at the curb. He was the doorman, standing there in the biting wind with a red uniform so crisp and sharp it looked like it belonged in a museum case. His face, though, was a different story. It was a tired map of deep-set wrinkles and leathery skin, the kind you only get from decades of working out in the elements. Johnson didn't offer a standard greeting or ask about the drive. Instead, he leaned down toward David, his movements stiff like a rusted hinge. His voice didn't sound like a normal man's. It had a dry, paper-thin rasp to it, sounding exactly like dead leaves skittering across a concrete sidewalk. He looked the 7-year-old right in the eye and asked a question that changed the whole vibe of the trip. "Did you see who moved the tree?" Yesterday, the doorman claimed, that massive fir had been sitting 15 feet closer to the far wall. David looked past the man's shoulder into the lobby, seeing the heavy iron bolts still sunk deep into the wood. They were solid, showing no signs of being dragged or tampered with. But Johnson wasn't just telling a story. He was offering a different kind of warm welcome. He made David feel like the only person in the building who was sharp enough to see the truth. Right then and there, the 7-year-old took it upon himself to help this old man out. He decided he was going to be the lead investigator. He told Johnson he'd help track down whatever was messing with the lobby. It was a bond formed in the dark, a shared secret that made the festive hotel feel suddenly like a mission field, one where the rules of the real world were beginning to fray at the edges. Johnson whispered about the Ghost Sisters, two lonely girls he said died in the hotel years back during a blizzard. He told David the girls were just playing pranks to get some attention because being dead is a lonely, thankless business. As the lead investigator, David spent day 2 on a slow, steady patrol. He walked the perimeter of the ballroom, dragging his hand along the cold stone walls. Every time his parents turned their heads to look at a menu or check a watch, Johnson would appear from the shadows of a hallway like he'd been waiting there since the hotel was built. He walked with a heavy, rhythmic thud of leather boots on stone, his breath making a strained, tight wheeze that sounded like a bellows with a hole in it. He insisted the tree had shifted even further during the night. David stood there in the ballroom, the holiday music echoing from the ceiling with a tinny, distorted quality that made the skin on his arms crawl. He stared at that tree until the shadows of the needles seemed to detach from the wood and move on their own against the granite. He was losing his grip on what was real, trapped in a psychological cage. Christmas morning should have been about the excitement of new toys, but for David, it was about the final report of his investigation. He found Johnson standing by the tree, his hand trembling as he pointed at a perfect circle of velvet chairs arranged around the base of the trunk. The doorman leaned in, his voice dropping to a breathy whisper that seemed to rattle in David's own chest. He said the ghost girls had held a party, and they wanted to thank the lead investigator for being the only one kind enough to notice their hard work. David felt a heavy, sinking sensation that had absolutely nothing to do with the mountain air. He felt like he had been dragged fully into a secret, supernatural world that no one else could touch, a place where the dead could reach out and pull up a chair. Checking out was when the reality of the situation finally snapped like a dry twig. David's father was tossing bags into the trunk, grumbling about the bill and the ice on the windshield. David tried to point out the doorman to his dad, wanting to tell his partner in the investigation goodbye. But his father just looked straight through the empty space by the door where the man in the red uniform was standing. His mother shivered and mentioned a sudden draft of cold air, pulling her scarf tight, but she didn't see the man standing right in front of them. When David looked back at the ballroom one last time, the tree sat exactly where it had been on the very first day. The iron floor bolts were rusted, caked with old dust, and completely undisturbed. That tree hadn't budged an inch. Adult years changed David, but they didn't stop the questions from eating at him. He went back to that mountain town as a man with grease under his fingernails and a need for the facts. He spent days digging through local historical archives and old newspaper records that smelled of damp paper and lost time. He searched for the legend of the Ghost Sisters, expecting to find a tragic story of 2 girls lost to the cold. He found nothing. No girls had ever died at that hotel. There were no sisters, no pranks, and no party. The story Johnson had told him was a total fabrication, a lie designed to bypass a child's defenses and force him into a world of shadows. Deep in a 1950s employee log, David finally found the black heart of the mystery. He pulled out a grainy black and white photo of the hotel staff. In the back row stood a man with the same frantic, lonely eyes and the same crisp red uniform. The record showed that Mr. Johnson had been a dedicated doorman for 30 years, a man who lived for the job, but he hadn't retired. He had died of a massive heart attack while decorating that very tree decades before David was even born. Real horror isn't always about a monster under the bed. Sometimes it's about the weight of helplessness in the face of a spirit that just can't punch the clock. There were no ghost girls, and there was no moving tree. Mr. Johnson was a lingering shadow, who had learned that haunted stories were the only way to get the living to stop and talk to him. He didn't move the furniture. He moved a 7-year-old boy's mind just to have a lead investigator to keep him company during his eternal shift. David left that hotel for the last time, knowing that the membrane between the safe world and the unspeakable is thinner than we think. He still thinks about that rasping voice and the way the old man thanked him for the help. It makes a man wonder about the strangers he passes on the road or the people standing in the quiet corners of old buildings. How many times have you stopped to talk to someone, never knowing that their heart stopped beating a lifetime before you ever walked through the door? Every Christmas Eve, at exactly 9 o'clock at night, the bones of my house start to sing. That is how Delaney always starts the story when people ask about the old colonial place in Charleston. She is a teacher, a woman who trusts facts and logic. But logic does not live in the lath and plaster of that 1920s home. The trouble began in 2019. Rain was slicking the cobblestones when Delaney and her husband, Rhett, opened the parlor wall for renovations. They found nothing but gray dust and rusted nails inside. They sealed it back up before the holidays, thinking they were just fixing a room. They didn't realize they had woken something up. Something in that dark space had been waiting a long time for fresh air to hit it. Christmas Eve arrived with a wet wind off the harbor. Inside, the house felt safe. Delaney was in the kitchen, and Rhett was settling the kids, Josephine and Miller, near the tree. Then the air changed. It wasn't a noise. It was a shift in pressure, like the feeling in your ears when a plane descends too quickly. Delaney dried her hands and walked to the hallway. A sound was drifting down from the second-floor landing. It was music. But it wasn't a radio or a phone. It was a pipe organ. It was playing "O Holy Night," but the notes were warbly and thin, like a recording from 100 years ago, scratching and hissing as it played. Delaney stood at the bottom of the stairs. The music wasn't coming from a room. It was coming from inside the walls. It vibrated through the wood, filling the hallway with a heavy, antique pressure. She looked at her children. Josephine looked confused, but 8-year-old Miller didn't look scared. He looked fascinated. He walked to the stairs and pointed a small finger at the mahogany banister. "Look," he whispered. "You can see it." Delaney squinted at the dark wood but saw only varnish reflecting the lights. She looked at Rhett. He saw nothing, but Miller insisted. He told his mother he could see the music. He described shimmering heat waves, just like the air over a hot asphalt road in July, dancing along the wood. While his parents heard only a melody, Miller was watching it ripple through the bones of the house, a private show just for him. Rhett pulled out his phone for proof. He held it toward the ceiling, the screen glowing in the dim hall. The organ reached a crescendo. He hit record, then immediately pressed play. The video played, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't the booming organ filling the room. It was distant, barely there. Delaney leaned close. Beneath the static, she heard a tiny, tinny melody. It sounded like it was coming from miles away or deep underwater. The phone had captured a ghost of the sound, proof to them, but just bad audio to anyone else. Desperate for validation, they tried to share it. On the second Christmas, they invited neighbors over. They sat in the living room, checking their watches. But when the clock struck 9, the house stayed silent. Miller saw no heat waves. The performance simply skipped a night, as if the house knew strangers were present. It happened every time. Grandparents, repairmen. If an outsider was inside, the house refused to sing. It drove the family mad. It felt personal, like the house was gaslighting them. The kids took it the hardest. Miller and Josephine tried to tell their friends at school. They were met with laughter and cruel names. The other kids called them crazy. They learned quickly that truth doesn't matter without proof. Eventually, they stopped talking about it. It became a heavy secret, a burden binding the family together against a world that didn't believe them. By the third year, they accepted their isolation. They knew the routine. At 9 o'clock sharp, the performance began. It lasted exactly 7 minutes. At 9:07 p.m., the sound would snap off, like a heavy needle being lifted from a record. But Delaney needed to understand. On that third Christmas, she ran an experiment. At 5 minutes to 9, she walked to the main breaker box and flipped the switch. The house died. The refrigerator stopped. The tree lights winked out. The house was a dark shell in a bright neighborhood. Delaney stood in the hallway, waiting. 1 minute passed, then 2. When the clock hit 9, the music started anyway. In the pitch black, the pipe organ sounded even louder. It echoed out of the plaster, a performance without power, a ghostly loop ignoring the rules of a modern home. Delaney felt a surge of fear. She stood near the parlor wall, the same wall they had opened years ago. She reached out in the dark and knocked hard. Bang, bang, the music warbled. It was terrifying. The notes distorted, stretching and twisting like wet paper being pulled apart before settling back into the melody. Delaney froze. The house wasn't just containing the sound. The house was the speaker. The wood and lath were the record, and she had bumped the needle. She waited. The song played on. She watched her watch. 9:06 p.m. 1 minute left. She reached out again. This time she didn't bang. She knocked a rhythm following the beat of the song. Knock, knock, knock. The music cut out instantly. No fade, no scratch. Just a sudden, heavy silence like a hand over a mouth. Delaney stood in the dark, heart hammering. 1 second passed, then 2. From deep inside the wall, right in front of her face, a sound came back. Knock, knock, knock. It matched her rhythm perfectly. But it wasn't wood. It was a sharp, dry crack. It sounded like hard bone striking against the backside of the lath. Delaney stepped back, breath catching. The hallway felt crowded. She realized she wasn't listening to a recording. She was interacting with something. The family stayed, but Delaney never touched the wall again. Weeks later, she went to the attic. Pulling back floorboards near where the music was loudest, she found a newspaper clipping from December 1924. It told the story of the original owner, a wealthy shipping magnate. But it was a tragedy. His wife, the love of his life, had died exactly 1 week before Christmas. Neighbors said he never spoke another word. On Christmas morning, he was found in the parlor. He hadn't died of a heart attack. The coroner called it natural causes. The neighbors called it loneliness. He had died in his favorite armchair, slumped over a wind-up gramophone. The machine was still spinning, but the music had run out hours before. Delaney read the clipping in the dusty light, and the cold truth settled over her. The 7-minute loop was not a memory trapped in the wood. It was a live performance. The man was still there. Every Christmas Eve at the hour of his death, he sat down to listen to the song he used to share with his wife. He wound up the machine, and he played "O Holy Night." He had been playing it for 100 years, alone in the dark, mourning the woman he lost a week before the holiday. But when Delaney knocked on the wall, she interrupted his vigil, and when he knocked back, it was his way of letting her know that finally he knew someone was listening. Now, when 9 o'clock comes on Christmas Eve, the family sits quietly. They don't invite guests. They don't try to record it. They just listen to the warbly, thin notes of the organ, accepted by a ghost that only performs for them. They watch Miller trace the invisible heat waves dancing on the banister, and they wait for the needle to lift, leaving the old man and the family he chose to their silence for another year. December 24th, 2020, was supposed to be the end of a long, greasy day for a man named Charles. At 35 years old, he had spent most of his life under the hoods of cars, and his world was made of things he could touch, turn, and fix with a wrench. He worked at a garage near Hawkhurst, Kent, a place where the history of 18th century outlaws and smugglers was usually just something printed on a tourist brochure. To Charles, the past stayed in the past. He lived by the logic of a circuit board and didn't have time for local legends whispered over a pint. He just wanted to get home, scrub the oil off his knuckles, and wake up for Christmas morning with his family. Narrow and unlit, the road home was a strip of black asphalt squeezed between high, thick hedges that seemed to lean over the car like they were trying to whisper to him. These hedges cut off the moonlight, making the modern world feel miles away. This stretch of road was a dead zone for travelers, a place where the air felt heavy and still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Charles settled into the driver's seat of his car, the engine giving off a steady, mechanical whirring that usually made him feel like he was in control. He was used to the dark, but tonight, the darkness felt like it was sitting in the passenger seat. Everything changed when a heavy, suffocating smell of wet iron and rusted metal suddenly filled the car. It was thick and oily, seeping out of the air vents like an invisible gas. At the same time, the digital clock on his dashboard began to change. The numbers didn't just tick forward. They started flashing a deep, sickly green. With every flash, a loud metallic clank echoed through the cabin, sounding like a giant iron gear was being hammered into place behind the steering wheel. Outside, a thick, glowing mist began to crawl across the road. It didn't drift like normal fog. It swirled in heavy, liquid loops that looked more like pouring milk than weather. Charles felt a heavy, leaden weight sink into the bottom of his chest, a feeling that told him the rules of reality were being rewritten. Reality started to slip away when the dashboard lights flickered and died. Charles reached for the radio, hoping for some static or a late-night talk show to ground him in the real world. Instead, a sound like a man choking on his own spit leaked out of the speakers, a wet, raspy hissing that had a rhythmic pulse to it. It sounded like breathing, but the breath was coming from something that hadn't seen the sun in 300 years. As he rounded a sharp bend, the smooth shush of his tires on the road vanished. In its place came a violent metal clattering, the cabin filled with the sound of iron shoes smashing against heavy cobblestones, and the steering wheel began shuddering in his grip as if he were driving over a rock quarry. Then, the air seemed to peel back like a piece of old wallpaper. In the white-blue glare of his headlights, an 18th century carriage appeared, sitting sideways across the lane. It looked like a gray, dusty memory that had suddenly grown solid. Charles could see the twisted branches of the hedges right through the horse's ribs, but the scene cast shadows that felt as heavy as lead. Two men in heavy cloaks and tricorn hats stood in the swirling mist. One held a long wooden flintlock pistol, pointing it straight at the carriage door. From inside, the coach came the sound of people shouting, a man and a woman arguing in thick, rough accents that sounded like they were being shouted from the bottom of a well. Charles slammed his foot on the brake, his heart knocking against his ribs like a loose piston. He watched, frozen, as the carriage lanterns cast flickering orange shadows across his hood. The smell of wet wool and horse sweat filled the car, sharp and stinking. Suddenly, a young woman lunged out of the carriage window. Her face wasn't scared. It was full of a dark, hungry rage. She didn't look for help. She pulled a knife from her clothes, the blade catching the light with a silver flash. With a cry that sounded like dry wood snapping, she buried the steel deep into the highwayman's chest. Charles heard it. The sickening, wet thud of the blade hitting meat. He heard the man's ragged, whistling gasp as he slumped over his saddle, clutching a wound that didn't bleed red. Instead, thick, black shadows spilled out of the man's chest, swirling into the mist like ink in water. Panic took over the horses. They reared up, their heavy hooves whistling through the air just inches from Charles's windshield. They bolted forward, dragging the massive wooden carriage directly at his car. Charles threw his arms up to protect his face, waiting for the sound of tearing metal and shattering glass. But there was no crash. The carriage passed through his engine and his body like a wave of freezing, oily smoke. The steering wheel snapped to the left, nearly breaking his thumbs, and a powerful electric quivering ran through his skin, making his hair stand on end. The bitter chemical sting of battery acid filled the back of his mouth. Then, it was gone. The lanterns, the horses, and the screaming vanished in the blink of an eye. Charles was left sitting in his car in the middle of a silent, dark road. His headlights were back on, shining on nothing but the normal, quiet mist of a Kent winter. The raspy breathing in the radio had been replaced by the soft, mechanical buzzing of his heater finally kicking back in. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely keep them on the wheel as he drove the rest of the way home, never exceeding 20 miles per hour. Later, Charles couldn't let it go. He found out the hard way that the world has a specific kind of math for people like him. If you see something on that road, you are statistically more likely to be silenced than helped. While nearly half the people you pass on the street say they believe in spirits, only about 1 in 10 will actually believe a person who claims to have seen one. That creates a massive gap in reality. Even the people who think ghosts are real will decide you are specifically lying or losing your mind. As a man, Charles is twice as likely to keep this a secret to avoid being called broken. It's a silence that rots into trauma, where you start to doubt your own eyes until your head snaps. Nearly 3/4 of these slips into the past happen to people driving alone. Without a passenger to verify the horror, your brain enters a state of war with itself. You aren't just scared of the girl with the knife, you are scared of your own mind. Out here in Hawkhurst, the ground is packed with iron and quartz, minerals that act like a massive natural hard drive buried under the dirt. When you drive over it at the right frequency, you aren't just watching a memory. You're interacting with the hardware. You're stepping into the machine. Every year, thousands of people vanish on rural roads with no skid marks, no phone signal, and no bodies. If Charles's car had been pulled all the way into that 1720s loop, the police wouldn't have found a crime scene. They would have found an empty road and a family who thinks he just walked out on them. The last time Charles saw that girl, the frost wasn't on the outside of his car. It was growing on the inside of the windshield. When he finally tried to tell his wife, she didn't look at him with fear. She looked at him with pity. That look is scarier than any ghost. It's the look that says, "You're broken." If you drive down that road near Hawkhurst this Christmas Eve, look at your radio. If the music turns to static breathing, do not stop. If you see the carriage, do not look the girl in the eyes. Because if she pulls you into her loop, the facts are clear. No one will find you. No one will believe you were ever there. And the world will keep turning while you are stuck stabbing a dead man for eternity.